Hello and welcome to yet another commentary from King's Comments on the Russia-Ukraine conflict or war. Today we're going to be talking about the geopolitical narratives that are starting to develop as a function of the battlefield successes that are coming out of the Russian offensive that's taken place here. I do want to make a couple of points, and that is that when it comes to war is a nasty business. Nobody should be clapping their hand and saying, oh, this is great. People are dying every day on both sides. And these are men that have families. These are men that have mothers, children, sisters. They have families. Each and every one of them do. And it's almost like it's a terrible situation to see how this whole thing has transpired over this time. Now, I do want to say this. Each side has a reason why they believe they're right. It's not for me to discuss who's right or who's wrong. What I can say is that as it directly relates to the Ukrainian side, the way that this war is being waged is completely the wrong way for them because of the fact that they have no conventional ability to win this war. Whatever opportunity they had to win this war was at the very beginning, even prior to their failed offensive in 2023. That opportunity has long since passed, and their depleting manpower is the major reason for their inability to win this, and the lack of munitions as well. And I do want to make that point clear because despite the fact that the Western nations are pouring aid in. What people just don't realize, perhaps, is that much of that aid that's moving into Ukraine is actually being siphoned off for nefarious activities on the part of individuals for their own personal needs. Any of the armor, any of the machinery, heavy armor that's coming in, is typically being destroyed at the point of contact as quickly as it's being brought in. We're looking at a grand total of close to $300 billion that's basically been wiped out on the battlefield since its fruition. And I'm talking about major artillery systems, major missile defense systems. We're talking about Bradley's infantry fighting vehicles, tanks of all of the NATO countries. They've been destroyed. And they're being destroyed systematically because of the fact that Ukraine doesn't have any air power. So it really creates a real problem for the Ukrainian soldier on the ground because the only thing they really have to rely upon is their depleted reserves of drones, which aren't good enough to deal with Russian artillery, Russian air force, and even the Russian FPV drone operators themselves. There's a huge numerical advantage coming out of Russia. So when we look at the numerical advantages in manpower, in arms production, in just about everything you can think of, the losses that the Russians are suffering are replaceable to the extent that new people can come up and fill those positions, and those new people are typically well trained. In the case of the Ukrainian soldier, unfortunately, they don't have that luxury. The majority of these soldiers have been on the line for 2 years. Proper rotation has not taken place. And the new recruits, word has it that many of these new recruits may be lucky if they get 2 weeks worth of training. And then they're put on the front where the life expectancy, as I mentioned in my last audio message, is a couple of days. Now, I also believe that the Ukrainian high command, the military high command, it has been completely derelict in their duty to understand even the basic military situation on the ground. So let's just talk about that real briefly. Let's just talk about the Kharkiv area, for example. The Russians deployed about 10 to 15,000 shock troops at best when they made their incursion in the Kharkiv Oblast area. They were able to secure a significant bridgehead to the point of advancing to, in the west, Lipsy, a major village or a major city, the closest major city to the border, and then to the east, Vovochansk, another major village within artillery range of Kharkiv itself. And the Russians never had the idea or notion that they were going to take Kharkiv with such a small force. The objective from the get-go was to tie up Ukrainian forces and force the Ukrainian brigades and battalions to move men from needed areas in the Donetsk area and the Luhansk area and the Zaporozhye region and move them to defend the Kharkiv area. And what we're seeing is exactly that play out on the battlefield. We're seeing rather large formations of Ukrainian soldiers forming and moving into undefendable areas and then being encircled. And so this is what's happening in a village called Vovochansk, which is on the eastern side of the Russian bridgehead. And what the Russians have basically done is they've fortified an area that's on high ground, and they have the ability to see everything. And the Ukrainians have decided to pour in men because they don't have armor, and much of that armor has been destroyed because it's been forced down one specific highway, with the Russians clipping all of the bridges in that specific area. So there's no armor there. So these men are taking up positions in what amounts to high-story buildings, as high as you can get for those villages, and they're being bombed to death. And what the Russians have done basically is decimated the infrastructure in northern Vovochansk, for example, and they've decimated it by just bombing it, artillerying it. And the Ukrainians, once again, are moving men in there without any armor and just getting killed. And these losses are significant. We're hearing stories of about 1,000 to 1,200 Ukrainian casualties daily, and that's along the entire front. But this is something that the Ukrainian military can't avoid to take, because if we use simple math and we went with 1,000 casualties a day, that's 30,000 casualties a month. If you continue along that path, then you're looking at 180,000 casualties in 6 months. And you've already taken 500,000 casualties up until this point. There's no room for error here because they just don't have the manpower. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at death by 1,000 cuts or death by 1,000 knives for the Ukrainian military. They just do not have the manpower. And what the Russian military is doing is degrading it and degrading it and degrading it to the point where, as a fighting force, it will cease to exist. Very similar to what happened to the German divisions in World War II on the Eastern Front. It's exactly the same process. And this is absolutely ridiculous because what they should be doing is fortifying their lines around Kharkiv, allowing the Russians to retain land at the expense of not losing men, because that would force the Russians to make some decisions about whether or not they plan on taking those fortified lines at great loss, because this is something that needs to be taken into consideration when the Ukrainians started planning out their plan of attack. But I also believe that what's forcing their hand, excuse me, as I mentioned earlier, was the Russian Air Force's FAB bombs. And these FAB bombs have been a game changer to the extent that fortified areas are completely being turned into dust. So perhaps the idea of fortifying lines doesn't matter as much because of the fact that the fortifications are going to turn into dust anyway. The one thing that I have noticed with the Russian Air Force is that they're using the FAB bombs only as it applies to large formations, whether it's in fortified lines or whether it's in buildings or building areas or building blocks. Excuse me. So it's not like the Russians are going to use FAB bombs where there's disbursements of Ukrainian forces in trenches. It doesn't make military sense for them to do that. That's more the role of the artillery or the Russian infantrymen or riflemen. So the Ukrainians, what they really should be doing is trying to create disbursement, meaning that don't have all your forces marshaled together, try not to counterattack, try to create a situation where the Russians are forced to make decisions where their losses are going to be very high. Right now, Russian losses are within the margin of error for them to be able to replace them easily and to be able to continue doing what they're doing from an offensive perspective. They're not paying demonstrably for the decisions they make, whereas the Ukrainian military is. So this leads me to some serious conclusions. And this is getting to the geopolitical narratives that I've been listening to from various sources. One such source is a gentleman by the name of Daniel Davis. He's got a YouTube broadcast which is very insightful. And the other day he had a professor on there who's well known in the academic community as well as the diplomatic community. His name is John Mersheimer. And the one thing I really like when I listen to John Mersheimer is how steady, calm, and unassuming he is in describing situations without getting emotional about it. And I think that's what's missing from the West. And that is that the decisions that are coming out of Western capitals, the decisions that are being made by Ukrainian leaders at this particular moment, they're devoid of rationale. And it's eerily similar to what happened in World War II. So let's just go back to World War II for a moment. You know, I mentioned earlier that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And that was one of an audio message that I'd done earlier when I first started the YouTube channel. And what I'm seeing play out here is we're seeing the same mistakes being played out. You know, Adolf Hitler refused to sue for peace. When he had asked Erwin Rommel for his situation report after the Allies had established a bridgehead in Normandy, Rommel told Hitler, sue for peace now. And the reason why Rommel told him that was because there was no way that Germany could win the war the way that it was being fought on the Eastern Front and on the Western Front. And he also knew that air power at the end of the day was going to essentially decide the war in general. And Hitler refused to listen to him, refused to negotiate a settlement. I'm not even certain that he would have been able to negotiate one because unconditional surrender was the only thing on the table, but he never reached out to find out what options he had available to him. What we're seeing today play out is exactly the same thing with Zelensky. Zelensky is completely lost in his own bubble. And I firmly believe that he's delusional because of the fact that he's not seeing the misery, or maybe he doesn't care, or maybe he believes that there's still hope. The Germans in the latter part of the war, they started creating these wonder weapons. They're called Wunderwaffe. And they started creating these things, and perhaps if they had these things at the very beginning, the war would have turned a different way. But the V-2 rockets, the jet airplanes, all these things started coming out at the end. And they did damage to the Allied pilots. They did damage to a lot of different things. In fact, they did damage to London during the war, at the tail end of the war. But it didn't change the outcome of the war, meaning that the war was already decided because Germany no longer had the capacity to manufacture in any quantity, and they didn't have the manpower to be able to handle it. And that's being played out to great effect right now on the battlefield. We're seeing a degradation of a military in ways that I would have never anticipated that quickly. This degradation has been unbelievable, to the extent that the Russians have eyes in the sky at literally every moment in time. And they have different ways to kill you, meaning that the drones, the artillery, the FAB bombs, the ODAB bombs, the missiles, the infantrymen, everything is on the table. And the Russians are thinking about opening up a new front in the Sumy region, which is northeast to the existing eastern flank of the Kharkiv bridgehead. And if that happens, in all likelihood, what we're looking at is a quicker way to eliminate any and all reserves that the Ukrainians may or may not have. Now, I want to talk about these reserves. Budanov, the intelligence chief for the Ukrainian military, said that Ukraine doesn't have any reserves and they're waiting on these new recruits. Many of these new recruits, as I said before, were kidnapped in cities that are basically empty. These are not patriots. These are people that don't want to fight. Otherwise, they would have already joined. And they have virtually no training. They're not professional soldiers, never wanted to be. And there's absolutely no way that these particular men can make a difference on the battlefield. They're basically cannon fodder. Again, it's not that I'm anti-Ukrainian. It's the mere fact that you cannot look at the facts on the battlefield and make any other conclusions beyond the conclusions I'm already drawing, which is that Ukraine lacks manpower. It lacks production. Even when you add all of its Western partners together, they just don't have the capabilities that the Russian manufacturers have. They don't have the capabilities. And you could see that even in the production of drones. Ukraine production's capacity is about 1/10 the size of Russian drone capacity. I mean, and they're growing every single day. The shell disadvantage is disparaging. I mean, the Russians are generating the equivalent of about 250,000 shells a month. The United States is about 25,000 shells a month. The Russians are firing 10,000 shells a day. The Ukrainians are firing about 1,000 shells a day. And that's if they get to fire them, because many of those artillery pieces are being destroyed as quickly as they're being found. So the Ukrainians really are at a supreme disadvantage, and the only thing that they have is their own bodies as their own armor. And we're seeing that play out to effect in Vovochansk, where they're being decimated, encircled, and destroyed in a way and in a function that we've seen in other battlefield narratives over the course of this war. So let's just take a look at the geopolitical side, or the narratives that are coming out of this battlefield situation. And I think this is something that we need to take a look at. I had mentioned earlier that the objective for the Ukrainian military at the outset of this war was to win quickly and then create a climate where they could negotiate from a position of strength. That situation has long passed. I'm not entirely certain why the Ukrainians are continually fighting when there's no hope that the Russians will leave the 4 provinces as well as Crimea. So any attempt to take back those provinces and Crimea, I mean, it's ridiculous, even the thought of it, because they just do not have the capability of clawing back the land that the Russians have previously taken in the last 3 months, let alone what they've taken in the last year and a half. So from a military objective point of view, I'm not entirely certain why they're continually fighting. It doesn't make any sense. Now, from the Russian perspective, it's a totally different narrative. The Russians hold all the cards right now, and John Mersheimer said as much, the professor and a well-known authority figure on diplomacy and this whole area. He was talking with Daniel Davis on one of their podcasts, and he was mentioning that the entire narrative doesn't make any sense from objectives. There are no objectives where Ukraine actually wins. I mean, I can't see it. I don't even know what winning looks like on the Ukrainian side. I would have to assume that winning on the Ukrainian side would have to mean that they still exist as some form of rump state moving forward. But even then, they're making that possibility less and less and less likely with some of the decisions that they and their Western partners are concocting. So let's just talk about these narratives for a moment. Recently, there's been discussion in Western capitals of allowing missiles to be fired, long-range missiles to be fired into Russian territory. And obviously, this would require Western technical support, Western mapping, targeting, you name it, because the Ukrainians simply do not have that capability or capabilities at present. And if that were to take place, then it exposes the West to enormous risks that I'm not entirely certain that their own population is even aware of, because it's not being discussed to the extent that it should in many of these countries and capitals. Because if people actually knew what was actually being said and talked about to the extent that they should, there would be massive protests in the streets, very similar to when Reagan put missiles in Europe in the 1980s and people freaked out. The Europeans are in no capacity to fight the Russians. And what they're doing is they're inviting a conventional as well as nuclear attack, not only on their command centers, but also on the sites where these specific launches are being made. They're also inviting attacks around the world on their own facilities. And this is a dangerous situation because NATO is not prepared to fight the Russians at this moment. And it's been talked about to a large degree here, and people are aware of this. But I think what you're seeing play out here is strategic ambiguity, and the Russians are fully aware of it, so they are just listening to it, watching things, and allowing the countries in NATO to talk and talk and talk and talk, which is what the NATO countries are really good at doing, as opposed to actually doing anything about it. Now, the situation, I believe, is going to get progressively worse for Ukraine. The Russians are going to look at this talk, and they're going to make decisions that, from a geopolitical perspective, may limit the West's ability to do anything thereafter. So one of the things that's come up from a geopolitical perspective is exactly what I thought would not happen, which is the Russians creating a buffer zone and actually taking Kiev. taking large parts of central Ukraine and western Ukraine to eliminate any capability of attacking anywhere along the Russian frontal areas of their region. And that's a dangerous situation for Ukraine because the Russians have the manpower, they have the will, and the ability to do that. Now, if the West wishes to put their militaries in harm's way in Ukraine without air support, then they're doomed to the same situation as the Ukrainian soldiers before them. And I can't see a situation where the West is willing to be a party to that. There may be countries that are willing to be a party to that, but NATO as a bloc will never unanimously consent to that, which is basically based off of a Article 5 situation. So I don't see how this works out any other way than a situation where Ukraine as a nation now ceases to exist the way that it's existing right now. The Russians have mercifully allowed Western leaders to be able to come into Ukraine, talk with Zelensky, and have news conferences with him in Kiev. That may soon end. You may not have Blinken going into Kiev anymore. You may not have German leaders or Western leaders walking into Kiev and talking tough. Those days might be at an end if the Russians decide that it makes sense to move their buffer zone deeper and deeper into those areas. I could see the Russians creating all sorts of buffer zones along their borders, leaving what's left of Ukraine to the devices of Poland and Romania to gobble up, and then jettisoning Zelensky out of the country if he isn't already eliminated by his own generals by that time. So the situation from a geopolitical perspective isn't looking good for the West. It's not looking good for the Ukrainians. And if it were looking good for the West, they wouldn't be talking about using long-range missiles. Because let's just be honest for a moment. The notion of using long-range missiles deep into Russia is not going to change the battlefield conditions in Ukraine. If anything, it will simply hasten Ukraine's demise in a way that the West can no longer be able to do anything about. And that's likely to happen as I see it. I don't see any soft landing for Ukraine here. As long as Zelensky is in charge, I don't see any soft landing. What I do see is a complete degradation of the front lines, where Ukraine probably has about 6-7 months worth of personnel at these loss rates to be able to fight. And I also see a situation where the Russians are just simply going to steamroll into other regions of the Ukraine region where resistance is futile or non-existent. This is the geopolitical narrative that's staring Ukraine in the face as it stands right now. And all the cards are with Putin. Now, we have an upcoming peace conference here in Switzerland. This peace conference is a bit of a joke. Excuse me, and it's a joke because one of the parties is not there, Russia. And it's also a joke because the United States is not there. It appears that Joe Biden has decided that a Hollywood fundraiser with Julia Roberts is more important than sitting and listening and falling asleep at a conference in Geneva, Switzerland. And of course, President Xi from China will not attend because he has his own peace plan. And that peace plan is the only one that's likely to be adopted. And it's the only one that's likely to create the kind of situation from a geopolitical perspective that keeps Ukraine alive. So without those two major countries involved, this is not a peace conference. This is a meet and greet, or as I like to call it, a meetup. And they could have done this through Eventbrite. It's a meetup where people are going to get free food and sit around and talk and tell you how wonderful they are. At the end of the day, none of it means anything. And it's a sort of a disgrace for the nation of Switzerland, because a country that claims to be neutral is no longer neutral anymore, and they've tarnished their reputation by even putting this nonsensical event on. It just absolutely is a farce, a joke, makes no sense, and there's nothing that one can hope to gain from actually being at this conference other than free food and getting to meet some new people or maybe some interesting people and forging contacts thereafter. But this is a complete and utter farce of a conference. And John Mersheimer said as much to Daniel Davis in his when he was questioned about this. He just basically said, I don't understand what the reasoning is for this. He said, this kind of diplomacy is bordering on infantile. It's bordering on crazy, and it's not even, it doesn't make any sense. And it leads me to believe that the people in the Western capitals are probably aware of the fact that they have a limited amount of time left in government because of their own economic conditions that's driving some of the situational changes that are likely to take place in their own capitals. I mean, I mentioned earlier that in places like Berlin, Paris, London, and Washington, the current leadership in all those countries are polling at historically low levels. And the notion or idea that conscription, which was brought up at a NATO meeting, is absolutely necessary, that's only going to drive more support into the arms of the right-wing parties. And who would have thought that the right-wing parties would be the ones on the side of peace and the neocon liberal parties would be on the side of war? But this absolutely makes no sense based off of the current geopolitical narrative and based off of the battlefield situation today. I mean, there's no point in Ukraine talking about winning. They can't win anymore based off of their original narratives. So what are their objectives moving forward? I mean, let's be realistic. Russia's not going to remove itself from the 4 regions that they're basically in the process of taking 100%. You can make the argument they've taken about 90% of the territories already, with the last bit being taken in this offensive that's going to last for quite some time. And I would suggest to anyone that's watching this thing that this offensive is going to be consistently an offensive all the time because of the fact that the Russians have significant reserves, and historically they've just gotten stronger as this thing has continued. From an economic perspective, the Russian economy is structured to grow at a faster rate than all the Western economies, despite all the sanctions that have taken place. So I'm just looking at this from a completely neutral point of view and looking at it based off of the numbers. Ukraine has inflicted losses on Russian positions, Russian military, but those losses can be replaced, and they're easily being replaced. The Ukrainians do not have that capability. And I said this before, and I'll say it again. If you have to kidnap men in the streets and then drag them into vans kicking and screaming, it's a pretty good idea, or it represents the mood of the country. It represents a situation where people are no longer interested in fighting. And I said earlier in a different audio broadcast that the original patriots that signed up to fight this war fought bravely. They fought as good as they possibly could have. They were denied a lot of the things that they should have gotten. The summer offensive of 2023 was a death-dealing blow based off of poor intelligence. And it basically cost the Ukrainians their very, very best men. And since that particular point, you've seen battalions sort of cobbled together. And these men that are still left from previous engagements where they've lost on the battlefield are in a situation right now where they are probably going to be completely decimated in the upcoming battles in the Kharkiv Oblast area, and in many different other areas that are yet to be determined as this war drags on. Now, I do want to make a couple of points about several of the YouTube channels out there that I've been watching, and one of the things I think that people have to understand is that if you want to get up-to-date information about what's happening on the battlefield, there's a lot of great mappers out there on the Telegram channel that are sort of mapping what's happening in terms of who's where on the battlefield, who's gaining what on the battlefield. And Ukrainian mappers, as well as Russian mappers, have been very accurate for the most part without the propaganda. It's been very, very interesting to see how Ukrainian mappers have shown pretty much what I've talked about, despite their obvious bias, wanting Ukraine to do well, Ukraine to win. The mappers have basically shown where the Ukrainians are in all of the regions and where they've fallen back to. And when you look at some of these summary channels, and I'll just name a few: Weeb Union, Dima at the Military Summary Channel, and Defense Politics Asia, and Theti Mapping, as well as HS Mapping, you can get a fairly good idea of what's going on just by looking at how these nonpartisan individuals are assessing the battlefield situation as they see it. And I find it quite interesting that most of the mappers go to great lengths to make sure that any areas that they shade in for the Russians or the Ukrainians, they need geolocations in order to make sure that there's proof of that. And even though the Russians, for example, may have taken a specific area, or the Russian Defense Ministry has said that they've taken an area, many of these mappers won't change the battlefield look of the map until there's a geolocation showing that. And from the perspective of public consumption, I think that's important. But what we're seeing essentially from all of the mappers is unanimity when it comes to the Russian advance, where the Russians are going and how they're doing things. It's been very, very clear, specifically in the Kharkiv Oblast bridgehead, that the Russians are playing the Ukrainians as fools. They're setting traps for the Ukrainian soldiers, where they're basically luring them in and then closing the trap on them. This is happening in Lipsy. This is happening in Vovochansk. And consider the fact that this particular oblast, the Kharkiv bridgehead, is being defended by about 10,000 Russian soldiers. The Ukrainians have, by some estimates, come in with about 25 to 30,000 men. And it's been a political narrative that they don't want the Russians to take Vovochansk or Lipsy. And so they've come in with these huge numbers, and they're being drawn in once again to encirclement, to decimation, and into a meat grinder, very similar to Bakhmut, without the Russians having to put in significant resources to lose on their own significant amounts of men. This is significant from a military perspective. I said this before and I'll say it again. The Ukrainian high command should be ceding ground because of the fact that in the Kharkiv direction, they didn't lay these defenses. They do have a third line of defense, which is significant, and they should be taking the majority of their forces and waiting for the Russians to come to them, and then probing from a military perspective to see what kind of strength that they're going to come with. Because 10,000 men isn't enough, or 15,000 men enough to probably break the Ukrainian third lines of defense and their third line of fortifications. The fab bombs obviously are going to make a huge difference and maybe the tipping point, but when it comes to this kind of military strategy, you can see the folly in everything that the Ukrainians are doing, because they're not taking into consideration their own manpower weaknesses, their manpower constraints. And this is a serious issue moving forward. So again, can the Ukrainians take 1,500 losses a day for the next 6 months? If this continues, there's absolutely no way that they can shape the battlefield in their favor, or shape the battlefield in general, in any way, shape, or form, with losses like this daily. So we'll soon see. I'll be coming out with a new commentary shortly, but this is the current commentary as of May 30th, 2024. Again, much of the same on the battlefield, with Russian successes all along the front, Russian advances all along the front, Russian breakthroughs all along the front. The only direction where you have a bit of a stalemate is in the Kharkiv direction, but that stalemate is by design, because of the fact that what the Russians are attempting to do is to corral, like in a pen, corral large formations of Ukrainian soldiers and decimate them here over time. So we will soon see what transpires thereafter, but I look forward to our next commentary. Thank you very much. Once again, thank you for listening. Please hit that like button and subscribe to support this channel. Much appreciated.